Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Scott, and I'm the Global Community Manager for NASA's International Space Apps Challenge. And as I hope you know by now, this weekend is the Space Apps COVID-19 Challenge, where problem solvers everywhere are coming together to create solutions to COVID-19 related challenges and challenges that people are facing all over the world. And speaking of being all over the world, in Washington, D.C., am so glad to have the chance to connect with none other than someone who has a storied history with space apps, someone who is a 2016 Space Apps Global winner for Best Use of Hardware, and someone who is almost completely on the other side of the world. So Alex, thank you so much for joining today.
Hi, Matt. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me.
It's good to be able to connect. And, I think some people, thankfully, just through the work that you've done, will be familiar with you, your work, and of course with Canaria. And so as we dive in, I'm excited to showcase your story and Canaria, but I'd love to start with you just introducing yourself and telling us what your relationship with space apps is.
Sure thing. So, hi everyone, I'm Alex Moss. I'm CEO and head designer of Canaria Technologies. And my relationship with space apps is that in 2016, in April, space apps was my propulsion into the technology industry and into hardware and into the realm of medical devices. So prior to that, I'd done businesses in the art and fashion world. I'd been a designer, I'd been an artist, I'd been a writer. But I came to a point where I really, really wanted to make the leap and become a medical device designer and get into the technology industry. And the NASA Space Apps Hackathon ended up being my breakthrough into that, where over the space of a weekend, it was my first ever hackathon that I attended. I met Dr. Robert Finian, who remains the co-founding chief technical officer of my company. And in the space of about 3 days, we came up with the concept for a first generation predictive medical device based on the ear, which was originally designed to do two things. It was designed to provide medical levels of accuracy for vital signs monitoring for astronauts aboard the International Space Station. And it could also monitor in real time the ambient carbon dioxide in the International Space Station. So that was a really wonderful experience. It was very hectic in the best possible way. We very quickly went on to win the NASA Global Award for Best Use of Hardware. And we quickly set up the company a few days after that. And now we're 4 years later in Australia. We just got to market with our devices. We've just closed our first major investment round. And we're now, 4 years later, have finally circled around after very large prototypes to actually coming up with our first ever proper wireless ergonomic earpiece, which can read your medical, not only read your medical grade vital signs in real time, but the important thing is the artificial intelligence aspect of what we're doing. So that based on your historical data, it can predict a serious medical event, but before it happens. And we've just brought a device to market that can predict heat exhaustion and extreme cognitive fatigue in our users in the heavy industries, but 10 minutes before it happens. And these are incidents which will cost companies $15, $20 million if someone has one microsleep at the wheel of a vehicle here in Australia.
Wow. I think that, thinking about even just your explanation of Canaria, where it started and just a little bit of what it is today, a lot of people might be looking at, you and the work that you're doing and think, how do you possibly go from space app solution to where you are today? Because clearly, there is a lot more than a hackathon weekend of work that's gone into building Canaria. But before getting into just where you are now and all that happened since space apps, I would love to focus on that hackathon weekend and where that idea was born. So, could you tell me a little bit about not only where the idea was born, but again, as a best use of hardware winner, how you went on developing the idea over the course of space apps?
Definitely. So I'll start from the beginning, as stories normally do, which was 5 days prior to the NASA Space Apps hackathon. I decided to start doing my homework, and there were 5 different categories that year. One of them was wearables, which I was drawn to because I knew that over the space of 3 days, I had to be able to come up with at least a solid proof of concept, if not physical. I knew that there would have to be electronics designs there. I knew there would have to be casing and CAD designs that were done over that period of time for whatever it was. So the initial concept was knowing that I had 3 days to come up with a proof of concept, to really keep it limited and focused to something that you could do in that period of time. So for instance, that year that I entered, there were also calls for new forms of rocket propulsion systems. But knowing my background and knowing what could be achieved in that period of time, any task like that, I just rejected off the bat of, I can't come up with something quality for that solution in 3 days. I'm not going to do it. I need to come up with something that's a serious solution to a problem. So I started researching 5 days in advance, stumbled across the carbon dioxide issue, looked into some of the history of the Italian Space Agency and how they've been focusing on full body wearable vital signs monitoring suits as proof of concepts. And I spent a lot of time just watching astronauts in the International Space Station and looking at archive footage of that. So I intuitively was taking a very user-centric design and thinking, if I really want to create something of value that could be of great value to NASA, that could be of great value to astronauts, I need to understand what their lives are like. What is it like to be every day on the International Space Station? What are your problems? What are your concerns? What makes you happy? What's your movement like? Which will, of course, heavily interfere any kind of wearable you design for that. I must have watched maybe just 8 to 12 hours of just back-to-back footage of astronauts, and to really try to place myself in those shoes and understand what the problem was. The one I came to was, my original concept was just a carbon dioxide monitor, but I knew it had to be based on the ear. And the reason for this is, looking into it, the International Space Agency hadn't come up with a way to detect hazardous pockets of carbon dioxide. And in a zero gravity environment, when you're just breathing in and breathing out, you really quickly get a very hazardous bubble of carbon dioxide in front of you. And at the time, the solution that NASA had for that was for astronauts just to go like this every few hours to disperse it. I will say that I know there are better solutions since then, a few years later, that have been implemented, but at that point in time, that's what it was. So I was also looking at myself and what I like to wear. I'm actually not a jewelry person. I find it irritating. I find it gets in the way. I find it gets caught on stuff. I don't like having stuff around my neck in particular, or my wrists or my hands. I just find it irritating. I was thinking, well, if you're getting dressed and undressed in zero gravity, that's got to exacerbate the problem then. So what could be a good form factor for a wearable carbon dioxide device that would be as non-invasive as possible for an astronaut's day-to-day? Now, I thought back to my experience in the fashion industry. I was living with a fashion photographer at the time, and I used to wear these huge Alexander McQueen ear cuffs that were had like a cult popular status around 2012. And I used to be able to wear these for weeks at a time without taking them off, in a way that I couldn't do with any other type of jewelry. I couldn't do with earrings. And the reason why is that it just hung really gently on the contour of the ear. And you could put a lot of weight there and it wouldn't interfere with you. And even it was huge feathers on the side of some of these, and it was just very comfortable. At that same time, I was reading a lot about medical device design. I was getting a lot very seriously into neurology at the time as well. And I had this aha moment of the reason why these ear cuffs were not obtrusive or painful is because around the contour of the ear, there are very few nerve endings in a way that there aren't, say, on the lobe of the ear. And I went, oh my God, Alexander McQueen accidentally came up with the best form factor for any kind of wearable device that a human being could wear in a zero gravity environment. So that was the initial concept. So I turned up on the day, 5 days later, knowing, okay, this is the thing, I'm going to do a ear-based carbon dioxide monitor. I went on stage, I pitched on stage, and I remember I was not well received when I was on stage. I almost got laughed off stage first thing in the morning for my concept of this ear-based carbon dioxide device. So I came off the initial pitch first thing in the morning feeling a little bit defeated, but then there was an electronics engineer who was interested in medical devices who came up to me and started speaking to me, Dr. Robert Finian, then become my co-founder, who went, actually, I think this is a really good idea. And I think there's something that you've missed out with this that you haven't realized. And that's if you're putting something on the earlobe, we can do pulse plasmography for vital signs from the ear as well. If we can adapt the device ever so slightly, and if you can streamline it as a designer, then we can do something that does both carbon dioxide detection, but then we can also provide medical grade vital signs monitoring to astronauts at the same time. And also of the problem of one, not having enough high quality vital signs data sets for researchers on Earth to analyze, but two, potentially be able to replace the full body monitoring suits that astronauts often have to wear for some of their more physiological and medical experiments. What if we could get rid of that and they just have something on the ear? So we can solve three problems at the same time. Now, there was one step on top of that where I was getting really interested in artificial intelligence. I mean, specifically, I was more interested in natural language processing at that point of time. But I was also starting to get interested in time series data sets and the idea of pattern fitting. And, you know, it's like the grown-up version of what's the next set of numbers in this series of numbers, like basically predictive.
Yeah.
So then I believe my response to that was, well, if we're doing pulse plasmography and it's just wavelength based anyway, could we not then add a machine learning element to that so that we could use those signals to predict, say, a heart attack, but before it even happens, if we had enough historical data? And Rob went, absolutely, that's absolutely a use case that we could do. And his background brought in brought more into that. And he went, well, Alex, if you know we do it that, it also works for epilepsy. So we could do it for that as well. And we went through a whole series of different use cases out of this really fast-paced conversation. And then we decided just to do it, and that was going to be our concept for the week. So it started off as a carbon dioxide monitor, but then once I met the person that I really clicked with, who had a complementary skill set to myself, that's when it really took on a new life of its own and became something that was so much more useful and so much more impressive. So the next 3 days were an absolute blur. We had to meet certain deadlines that we given ourselves to make sure that we could have something good to show at the final pitch for the final pitch session for our solution, which I say at the time I didn't realize that we even had to do. I just wanted to produce something that was to some degree professional or pseudo-functional, if not totally functional. The mentors were really helpful. And it was actually the mentors earlier on in that piece, where it must have been hour 8 or hour 10 in this, who came round to us and went, well, you know that this would be perfect in the mining industry because they have the same problems. If you're thinking about vital signs and prediction and you're thinking about carbon dioxide, that's the classic use case in mining, and that's Canaries, hence Canaria came about that way. So it was with the support of the mentors there. There was also a good sense of energy and there was a good pace with everyone else who was there as well, that we were able just to complete something. We didn't sleep for the entire time. I tell a lie, I fell asleep on the floor for 2 hours under a desk at one point. And then I got up and finished off the CAD designs for the original earpiece. And it was just a haze. Pitched, not thinking very much out of it. I think throwing yourself into any new fast-paced project like this, the aim of it isn't necessarily winning. The aim is coming up with the best extraordinary proof of concept for something that you can, and that being the focus of it. I think that came through in what we ended up creating. I think that came through in the way that I pitched it to judges at the end of that. And it was genuinely a shock and a surprise, for me anyway, I think less so for my founder, who was much more experienced, my co-founder is much more experienced than myself, that we had won that national round a few hours later at the end. And then we had a day to recover and celebrate, and then we had to move straight on to, well, okay, well now we've got to try and win the global award.
Mhm.
since we have the opportunity to, which was a whole other completely different experience.
That's so powerful, and I appreciate you walking through that experience, because it really paints the picture of what your hackathon experience was like, and I'm sure what a lot of hackathon experiences are like. But one question I have for you based on that, it does seem like, there you met a lot of people who were really pivotal to your journey and to developing Canaria to be what it is today, even, and what it would be at the end of the hackathon. But I wonder, you know what advice do you have for participants? I mean, especially thinking of this virtual hackathon, what
Mm.
advice do you have for participants to almost replicate those conditions so that they could be, get that proper insight? And I'll share, just before even getting into your answer, that we do have subject matter experts online on Space
Mm.
Apps Chat, from NASA, and also from the European Space Agency, and from the Canadian Space Agency, and French Space Agency, and Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency. And so there are people there, but I wonder, like, what advice you would have for people to not only like reach out to those people, but get the insights that they need to create something that is like actually impactful and solving real problems.
Yeah. So I'll use a comparison, which is I tend to have a general structure now for hackathons that I attend. I still attend hackathons and make sure that my engineering team comes with me, so that we're always refreshing our skill sets and just being reminded of how it's like to come up with a really fast-paced proof of concept for a problem in about 3 days. The first 6 hours of any hackathon, if you aren't already coming with an idea, I'll actually say even if you are already coming with an idea, that's the time to be brainstorming and having a really, really open mind. Don't poo-poo anyone's ideas until you actually have evidence that they just won't work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important because there's also a social aspect within that first 6 hours. You need to find a team that you click with. If you have an instinct that someone, I don't know, is really like rubbing you up the wrong way, don't work with them. It's that easy. Like, you need to find people that are really supportive and also open-minded, but can also get hard work done when it comes down to it and they're good under pressure. So that first 6 hours, it's being really open-minded, listening to people's ideas, listening to what's already been out there. That's the time. If you'll probably have a few ideas floating around with your colleagues at that point, that's the time to reach out for experts. Like, start getting a sense, like, well, we've got 5 things that we think are cool, that we think there's some validity to them. Towards the end of that 6 hours is the time for you to reach out to experts for each one of those and work out which one is the most useful. And also which ones just either have already been done, or just aren't a viable solution. Like, you need to really be able to speak to subject matter experts to just slash that decision-making process down and get closer and closer and closer to what your final proof of concept is going to be. And it's like chiseling away at a big block of marble to get to the sculpture inside. It's like lots of fast little chisels to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, the subject matters will lead you to slightly different ideas as well. It will have a common theme, probably, with what you're discussing with them. Again, be open-minded to that. Respect the mentor's experience. Don't be insulted if someone tells you that your idea isn't going to work for some reason. That's the time to listen to them. At the end of that 6 hours, you'll probably have 2 or 3 ideas that have some good weight to them. You've then got about 4 hours to narrow down with your team which one is the one that you're going to go for, and just be brutal about it. You have to stop being open-minded at that point and go, we now need to produce something that is really, really useful. So out of these, which is the most valuable? What's going to get the most amount of uptake? Who would use it? Are they likely to use it? What are the roadblocks to this solution? Because all hackathons and the problems within them are a microcosm of the real world. And your solution has a better chance of winning if you're already thinking about how would this be adopted if we were to release it into the real world, next week. If we could wave a magic wand and have a finished product, what really are going to be our barriers to entry? Who's really going to use it?
Mm-hmm.
And also, how big an idea is it as well? Yeah. I mean, I think the beauty of these hackathons is that you have free reign to go out and do something extraordinary. This is not the time to be thinking about humdrum day-to-day activities. Are any of these ideas, one, viable? Two, will they really make a difference in the world in a serious way if they were to become real? And then three, are you able to narrow down that concept enough to come up with a good proof of concept in about 48 hours at that point?
Mm-hmm.
If you anchor it to those three questions, by hour 12 of your hackathon, you'll have got the solution that you need to work on for that remaining period of time. And after that point, then it's just divvying up within your team who's got the best skill sets for what. When's your time to break? You need to eat. Every time you're eating, talk to an expert to get another opinion on what you're doing and get people to review that solution that you're then working on for that remaining period of time. And then if you pace it right, probably about an hour, if you're lucky, before you have to pitch or go on stage, you'll have completed a really strong proof of concept for an important real-world solution. It looks great, it has some degree of functionality, and you've at least roughly rehearsed what that pitch is going to be by the time you're pitching to judges.
Yeah, I think the thing that sticks out to me about even what you're saying is, you know, it just in different elements of that explanation, what occurs to me is that mindset is so important. So if you go in with the mindset that you want to create something that will solve actual problems, that could potentially be functional, that would be appealing to whether it's investors or appealing to an industry that has a need, then that's an important first step, or that's an important step in order to develop that solution that makes a difference. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
My thoughts on that is that I think there's actually one really good question to ask yourself, even if you're just working on something for 3 days at a hackathon, which is what this concept is important enough for, if I had the chance to, would I spend the next 10 years of my life working on it?
Wow.
And if the answer is yes, you've really come across a phenomenal idea for a great proof of concept that doesn't just have legs for being seemingly impressive within a hackathon. It's something you could take to market after that, or like actually spin out to its own company. But that said, I mean, again, looking at hackathons and microcosms of the real world. So the things that will perform best on stage just for showing that initial proof of concept will have that gravitas to them. It should have that oh wow moment of like, oh, if this was real, this would be world changing or life changing for enough people. And yeah, I think the 10-year metric is a good one. Those kind of solutions that evoke that wow sensation in an audience or a group of judges it's important enough that you would spend the next 10 years of your life working on this if you had the chance to.
Wow. But first of all, I think it's so interesting because, again, that I know that's not always the way that people that we go into hackathons thinking about, you know, is this a solution that I'm creating that would be something that gives others that sense of awe, really over the next 10 years or long term or whatever that period of time is. But speaking of, you know, just the long-term journey, I think it's so amazing that you've had your journey since Space Apps, and it's been a really prolific one. And it's also powerful that participants could hear from you, you know, what that journey's looked like since. And so I know it's been a long one, but in short, because I know you've accomplished a lot, you know, what have been some of those highlights since your Space Apps journey just a handful of years ago?
Yeah, a few. I'm thinking of what are important highlights. Highlights as well, because I don't want to over romanticize it either, because it's incredibly difficult to make the leap and create your own technology company and bring a concept to reality and bring that to market. But we don't have to talk about that right now. Let's think about the highlights instead.
Right.
So one of the first highlights was the immediate wave of press attention that we got off the global win of the NASA hackathon. And I suddenly went from being completely new in the industry, just getting into it, to being interviewed by the BBC within a matter of weeks. And then that was a highlight, and then waves of press come and go. So that was a nice wave, and it was a nice wave of confidence of, wow, no, I have come up with something that is worthwhile really working on for the foreseeable future. There's real legs to this beyond just the accolade of the global award. Now, that initial wave of press attention led to, about half a year later, we then got picked up by Richard Branson's Extreme Tech Challenge, which is known as one of the biggest and at points most delightfully ludicrous technology competitions in the world, where all of the top 10, you end up being flown, you go out to the semi-finals in Las Vegas at the time, you would then go to Necker Island to go have dinner with Richard Branson himself and do a whole pitch there. But through that, you also get to know the judges during that process. And we ended up meeting one of the original investors in Twitter, Bill Tai, who gave us some really strong advice and introductions that led to the company then moving to Australia and getting our first pre-seed investment round closed. And that was really pivotal, especially considering the fact that on that day, I pitched really badly at the semi-finals. And I remember that very clearly. I properly stuffed up on stage. But we'd had a good conversation with each other before that, and he came to me afterwards with the Canaria concept. And well, I agree with you. I think that mid-term and long-term, this is space. Long-term, this is a health solution, but your beachhead market is probably mining. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to do that and get to market there, your options are either going to be Canada or they're going to be Australia. Now, out of everyone in the world, frankly, it's a waste of time for you to go and do something like Y Combinator because your clients and your market just isn't there. So you need to go off and work with a group called Unearth to run an accelerator program who do invest in early stage companies, and they will just propel and focus on you getting to market. So that was done, made the note of that, got in contact with them. I think it was another half a year or 8 months later, we then got accepted into their accelerator program, and we had 10 days notice to move from London to Australia and Brisbane, Australia, which is where I'm speaking to everyone now from. 10 days notice in order to come over for their investment offer to be valid. And we went, yeah, let's go for it. So we moved in this period of 10 days, knowing that we had to move to wherever we needed to go to get to market. And London was definitely not the place in our industry to do that. So we were happy to move to Canada. We would have been happy to move to Australia. I'm a little bit happy. I don't like the cold. So I'm pretty happy that it was Australia because it's just so beautiful here. Oh, yeah. So that was definitely, a big highlight of the first round of investment into the company and starting to be taken seriously. Other highlights, serious other highlights, were the first time we ever deployed a piece of our equipment in the field, and it worked. Mm-hmm. And that was after some initial university studies. So having people in extreme environments, the first ever pilot was a heat exhaustion prediction pilot. And having our devices that were our last generation, actually, which was a belt-mounted device, which I've actually got with me, which is about this big, which is our previous generation. And we had to go through so many iterations to make sure that we'd actually created the right thing in practice. As a slight tangent with hardware, everyone assumes that it's miniaturization, which is the tough bit. It's not. Miniaturization is actually probably one of the easiest parts in the process of hardware development. It's making sure that you've got the electronics and the software right to actually do what you think it should be doing in the first place. And then once you've cracked that, it's easy to miniaturize. It took us about 3 years to crack that. So having it deployed in the field, having people use it, and seeing that first data set come through, where all of our assumptions about being able to predict heat exhaustion were proved correct, and not just in a lab setting, in an extreme heavy industrial setting with our first group of users. And yes, we could predict a heat exhaustion event in a user, which is a huge problem in Australia and a lot of countries around the equator, but people will just die from heat stroke whilst working. And yeah, that first data set where, yeah, we were right, we can predict heat exhaustion 10 to 15 minutes before it happens in our users.
Yeah.
That was, yeah, a huge highlight. Other ones, getting our first amount of serious government funding as well. And again, having that validation that yes, it's paid off, we've gotten used to writing grants. There's a national interest in what we're doing beyond just a business approach to it, that it was valued by the government as important for the nation that we had based our company in to have this device come to market. And then again, also recently was closing our seed investment round with a really awesome investor that we spent years finding, because we really wanted to find someone who appreciated that we were working on an international level.
Right.
So in Australia, to give some context, it's really difficult to raise seed capital here because the valuations for Australian tech companies are just really, really low. So it's not uncommon at all to have, frankly, inexperienced angel investors or even inexperienced venture capital investors trying to dilute a company 20 to 40% on the first seed investment round. Not thinking like, yeah, I got the best seed, I'm going to be like a majority shareholder. Like, yes, definitely good business. Not realizing that if you do that, you can never raise a Series A in the US and seriously get to a global market because you've just given up a stupidly large chunk of equity for hardly any money compared to the international standards for tech. So we spent a good period of time finding an investor who got that it wasn't about the percentage of equity, it was about the likelihood of making sure that a company can survive in the long term and get to a next investment round in a year or 2 years' time, and be able to succeed beyond just like the blinkers on, how good is this term sheet? It's, well, what can I do to make sure that this company really succeeds, and how can I support that in a way that benefits both parties and is a fair deal to both?
Yeah.
So I think it was a bit of an investment tangent.
Yeah, no, but I think that's powerful, because a lot of what you're talking about, if I'm a Space Apps participant, maybe I'm not familiar with, with half of what you were sharing around investments around Series A and so on and so forth. And so, there's a saying, you can't be what you can't see. And I think that's powerful and speaks to the power of, again, sharing your story, so people who are in Space Apps could see, Alex is at this point, Canaria is at this point now, today in 2020, but it started somewhere else in 2016. And so, the big question, and the last question really I have for you is just, is there one piece of advice you would have for people who are, taking part in the Space Apps Hackathon this weekend, or even in a future Space Apps Hackathon, that know that they want to turn their project into something that will be their work, their life's work for the next 10 years, but don't know how to get there? What's that advice for them, as it stands this weekend, because they haven't even fully developed their solutions yet as of now?
Okay, so probably a few just quick fire ones would be: do your homework, turn up on time, take your project seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. Be willing to accept criticism as part of the process. And if you don't know what to do next, that's completely fine. No one knows what to do next of their own accord. But the best way to find out what to do next is to find the person that you want to be, who's the best expert at that subject. Excuse me. Introduce yourself, be pleasant, write an introduction letter, ask for their help, ask for their advice. And if you just continue to do those things, that little basket of advice there will take you to the end of this hackathon. It will take you beyond to a proof of concept. It will take you beyond that to working out how to get onto an accelerator program, how to build a team, like how to go past that to seed rounds and getting something to market. Yeah, do your homework, be on time, take your product seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. accept criticism, and if you don't know what to do next, find someone who does.
Just to build on one of the points that you mentioned there, and actually you stated this in a couple of different ways, but it's really occurring to me that oftentimes, like, I think of school, because there are a lot of students who participate in space apps. So I think of school, and I think of back to school, and you're not encouraged to look at other people's, you're discouraged from looking at other people's work. You're discouraged.
Oh, I was wondering if this was about to be about plagiarism versus, okay, yeah, continue.
But I think it's to that point, in a sense, where we're almost conditioned to think of things from a plagiarism lens, where you need to create something, you need to come up with something from scratch, when really, when you're building a business, or any successful thing or project, whatever it might be, it's so important to look at the landscape and to understand what's been done, what's out there, what has succeeded for other people, what has failed for other people, because that could really, not only save you a lot of time, but inform your path, your unique path. But it's so important to be educated on just the landscape, which I've noticed is a big theme in a lot of what you've talked about, even going developing that idea and having that background in a number of areas that were relevant to what you developed for Canaria. So
yeah, well, there's no such thing as original genius. I think that's a really common misconception, that you can come up and out of nowhere, like SpaceX didn't just happen overnight. I mean, it was presented that way in the press when they started getting serious traction. It must have been what, like 5-7 years ago that they only started to become a news story. That wasn't the case. You have to build upon the research of other people. Like, it's fine to replicate and test. Usually in that process of replicating, say, I'm studying electronics, and I think about predictive algorithms and biometrics. Like, you have to borrow from other people's research and reverse engineer it yourself to understand how it works, and to test that it does work as well.
Yeah.
And to prove that it's seriously well done, peer-reviewed research. But what's often ignored is in that process of reverse engineering something, you learn something new during that process, and you'll hardly ever release the exact same thing. Just that process of understanding something, learning something, replicating something, you'll always realize, oh, but if I did this about this, then it would be better. And just in that process, you've already changed something. You've created something new. That's how new intellectual property is developed and created. So don't be afraid to replicate a piece of research or someone else's work. That's the best way of learning. And it's only through that process that you end up creating something truly original. The whole thing isn't original. No one goes out and reinvents the wheel. It's how do you interpret it through your eyes that are unique to you, with your own experiences. That's what makes something original.
This is powerful, but thank you so much, first of all, for sharing just so much of your journey. And I think that just you've gone into so many of the details of what you've experienced over the last 4 years, and really what Canaria's been through, and just all of those steps, which speaks to the collaborative spirit of space apps. And really, it is so important that we have you to share, because now people could learn from your journey. But as we wrap up, I sort of want to just give the floor to you for any final words of wisdom that you have for the space apps community.
Just keep doing it. I think, honestly, Space Apps is a really, really important hackathon and series of events. It's like the fantasy and the beauty of space unites so many people across so many disciplines in a way that very, very few other things do. And at every hackathon, at every NASA Space Apps hackathon events, like, you don't just get people with a physics background or people with an electronics engineering background or a machine learning background. You'll also get artists, you'll get industrial designers, you'll get people who are just interested and have their own unique skill set to bring. I think tech is usually oversold as like, no, if you if you can only do it if you code. But the technology industry doesn't work like that. You need business developers, you need marketing specialists, you need user interface designers who might not know how to code, and that's fine. But you need them as a crucial part of that team. Otherwise, you can't release something into the world and have it work. So the collaborative spirit's important, the energy is important. It's honestly one of the best series of events in the world for finding long-term collaborators. I really believe that about space apps. So just keep going, have a good time with it, you know, keep an open mind, you know, move fast, break things and make things.